Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. On August 10th, 1991, in the small town of Martinsburg, West Virginia, at the Sheraton Inn pushed open the door to room 517. She was running behind schedule that Saturday morning, and the "Do Not Disturb" sign had been hanging on the doorknob since the previous afternoon. The guest had checked in alone 2 days earlier, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an easy smile, who'd told the front desk he was a writer working on a book. He'd seemed pleasant enough, polite, the kind of guest who didn't cause trouble. The housekeeper knocked twice, called out her standard greeting, and when no response came, she used her master key. The bathroom light was on. That's the first thing she noticed. A thin strip of yellow illumination spilling out from beneath the door, pooling on the carpeted floor of the main room. The curtains were drawn, casting the rest of the space in shadow despite the late morning hour. She called out again, louder this time, announcing herself as she stepped inside. The air felt wrong somehow, heavy and still, like the room had been holding its breath. She moved toward the bathroom, her hand reaching for the door handle. What she found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. The man was in the bathtub, fully clothed except for his shoes, which sat neatly beside the toilet. His arms hung over the sides of the tub, wrists turned upward, and the water around him had long since turned cold and dark. Deep gashes ran vertically along both forearms, precise and deliberate, the kind of ones that spoke of determination. Razor blades lay scattered on the bathroom floor, along with what appeared to be typed notes. The scene looked staged, almost too perfect, like something from a movie rather than real life. But the body was real, and Joseph Daniel Casolaro, 44 years old, father of 2, freelance journalist and aspiring author, was undeniably, irreversibly dead. The Martinsburg police arrived within minutes of the 911 call. The initial assessment was quick and, to the responding officers, seemed straightforward. They saw what they'd been trained to see in such situations. A man alone in a hotel room, far from home, with self-inflicted wounds and apparent suicide notes. The bathroom door had been locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry into the room itself. No evidence of a struggle. The deceased's rental car sat undisturbed in the parking lot, his belongings apparently untouched. Every surface element of the scene pointed toward a conclusion that police across America encounter with tragic regularity. A troubled individual, overwhelmed by circumstances, choosing a permanent solution in an anonymous hotel room. But almost immediately, questions began to emerge. Questions that would transform this apparent suicide into one of the most controversial and debated deaths in modern American history. Questions that would spawn conspiracy theories reaching into the highest levels of government, connecting dots across decades of alleged corruption, murder, and cover-up. Questions that, more than 3 decades later, remain unanswered. Danny Casolaro's family and friends received the news with shock that quickly curdled into suspicion. This wasn't right, they insisted. Danny wouldn't do this. Not now. Not when he was so close to finishing the biggest story of his career. Not when he told multiple people was on the verge of a major breakthrough. Not when he'd been excited, energized, more alive than he'd been in years. The Danny they knew wasn't depressed. He was careful. He was meticulous. And he was absolutely convinced that he was about to expose what he called the Octopus, a vast criminal conspiracy that he believed connected numerous scandals spanning 4 decades of American history. To understand what happened in Rue 517 of the Sheraton Inn that August weekend, we need to understand Danny Casolaro himself. We need to know who he was, what he was investigating, and why his death, whether by his own hand or someone else's, sent shockwaves through communities of journalists, whistleblowers, and independent researchers that continue to reverberate today. Joseph Daniel Casolaro was born on June 16, 1947 in McLean, Virginia, into a world of relative comfort and opportunity. His father, a respected physician, provided the family with a stable, upper-middle-class existence in the shadow of Washington, D.C. Danny grew up in a household where education was valued, where dinner-table conversations touched on politics and current events, where the proximity to the nation's capital made government and power feel tangible rather than abstract. He was bright, curious, blessed with a quick wit and an engaging personality that made people want to talk to him, to confide in him. After graduating from high school, Danny enrolled at Brown University, one of the Ivy League's most prestigious institutions, but his time there proved to be brief. After completing his freshman year, he made the decision to leave, a choice that disappointed his parents but reflected Danny's growing restlessness with conventional academic paths. He wasn't rejecting education itself, those who knew him said, but rather the structured, predictable trajectory that universities represented. Danny wanted something more immediate, more hands-on, more connected to the real world he could see evolving around him in the tumultuous late 1960s. He returned to the Washington, D.C. area and began to pursue writing, his true passion. Unlike many aspiring writers who struggle in obscurity, Danny had some early success. He wrote for various publications, developing a style that was accessible and engaging while still maintaining depth and nuance. His work appeared in newspapers and magazines, covering topics that ranged from local politics to cultural trends. He married, started a family, and for a time seemed to be building the kind of stable, productive life his parents had envisioned for him, albeit through a slightly different road. But Danny was never content with surface-level reporting. Friends and colleagues described him as someone who always wanted to dig deeper, to find the story beneath the story, to connect seemingly disparate events into larger patterns. This tendency would serve him well in his journalism, earning him a reputation as a thorough and persistent reporter. But it would also lead him down paths that more cautious journalists might have avoided, into territories where questions multiplied faster than answers, where every revelation seemed to open doors onto darker rooms. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, Danny worked steadily as a freelance writer. He covered a variety of beats, never specializing too narrowly, always keeping his options open. He wrote about business, politics, technology, crime. He developed sources across multiple sectors, building a network of contacts that would prove crucial to his later investigations. Those who worked with him remember a man who was professional, reliable, and unusually good at getting people to open up. He had a gift for making sources feel comfortable, for asking questions that sounded casual but were actually precisely targeted, for listening in a way that encouraged people to say more than they'd initially intended. His personal life during this period was more complicated. His marriage ended in divorce, a painful process that left him as a non-custodial father struggling to maintain close relationships with his 2 children. Friends say the divorce hit him hard, that he carried guilt about the disruption to his children's lives, that he tried to overcompensate during his visitation time, showering them with attention and activities. He moved into a modest townhouse in the Tysons Corner area of Virginia, a bachelor space that reflected both his limited finances and his tendency to prioritize work over domestic comfort. Money was often tight. Freelance journalism, even for talented writers, rarely provides the financial security of a staff position. Danny took assignments as they came, wrote quickly when deadlines loomed, sometimes stretched himself thin trying to cover his child support obligations and basic living expenses. But he never seemed to lose his enthusiasm for the work itself. Writing wasn't just how he made money. It was how he made sense of the world. It was his way of participating in the larger conversations that shaped society. It was, in a very real sense, his identity. By the late 1980s, Danny was in his early 40s, a time when many journalists have settled into comfortable niches or moved into editorial positions. But Danny was restless. He'd been kicking around the industry for nearly 2 decades, had produced solid work, had earned respect from his peers, but hadn't broken that one big story that would define his career. He was good, everyone agreed. But he hadn't yet been great. He hadn't yet found the story that would transform him from a reliable freelancer into a name people recognized. That was about to change. In 1989, Danny Casolaro began to investigate what initially seemed like a relatively straightforward story about a software company. The company was called Inslaw, and it had developed a sophisticated database program called PRMS, an acronym for Prosecutors Management Information System. On the surface, this was a business dispute, the kind of dry legal battle over intellectual property that might merit a few paragraphs in the business section, but wouldn't capture broader public attention. Inslaw claimed that the U.S. Department of Justice had stolen their software, using it without proper licensing or compensation, then distributing modified versions to various government agencies and possibly even foreign governments. But as Danny started pulling on this thread, he began to notice something strange. The story kept expanding. Every interview led to 3 more sources. Every document raised new questions. Every attempt to verify one claim led to discoveries about other, seemingly unrelated issues. What had started as a story about software theft began to touch on organized crime, on covert intelligence operations, on political corruption at the highest levels. Danny started to see connections between the PRMA software case and other scandals that had erupted over the previous decades. The October surprise allegations, the Iran-Contra affair, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International collapse, Native American tribal corruption, the Cabazon Indian Reservation weapons testing. To most observers, these were separate incidents, discrete scandals that happened to occur during the same general time period, but had no underlying connection to each other. But Danny began to develop a different theory. He started to believe that all of these apparently separate events were actually tentacles of the same creature, arms of a single vast conspiracy that had operated for decades, reaching into intelligence agencies, into the Department of Justice, into Congress, into the White House itself. He began calling this conspiracy the Octopus, an 8-armed creature whose tentacles stretched across the government and beyond, coordinating criminal activities that served the interests of a shadowy network of power brokers who operated outside democratic oversight or legal accountability. It was an extraordinary claim. The kind of claim that, if true, would represent one of the greatest journalistic exposes in American history. The kind of claim that, if false or exaggerated, could destroy a journalist's credibility and mark him as a conspiracy theorist disconnected from reality. Danny was aware of the risks. He knew he was wading into deep, dangerous waters. But he was also convinced. The more he dug, the more connections he found. The more sources he contacted, the more pieces seemed to fit together. He wasn't imagining this, he told friends and family. This was real, and he was going to prove it. Danny's investigation became all-consuming. He filled notebooks with handwritten notes, created elaborate timelines, drew diagrams connecting people and events across decades. His townhouse became cluttered with boxes of documents, files stacked on every available surface, photocopied pages spread across tables and floors. He traveled constantly, meeting sources, conducting interviews, following leads. He made dozens of phone calls every day, checking facts, cross-referencing stories, pushing for more information. His phone bills became astronomical, his credit cards maxed out. He borrowed money from family members, from friends, always promising that the book would pay everything back once it was published. Because Danny wasn't just writing articles anymore. He decided that the octopus story was too big, too complex, too important for magazine pieces or newspaper exposés. This required a book, a comprehensive work that would lay out the entire conspiracy in meticulous detail, that would present documentation and testimony sufficient to convince even skeptics that something deeply wrong had been happening in the shadows of American government for decades. He'd already secured a publisher's interest. He had an advance, though not a large one. He had a deadline. He had a title, be A Pale Horse, taken from the biblical book of Revelation, a reference to death riding into the world. His family and friends had mixed reactions to Danny's obsession with the octopus. Some were supportive, excited by his passion and convinced by his arguments. Danny was persuasive. When he talked about his research, laying out the connections he'd discovered, showing documents and describing interviews, it was hard not to get caught up in his conviction. Others were more concerned. They worried about his mental state, about whether the stress and isolation of the investigation was affecting his judgment. They worried about his finances, about the toll this was taking on his relationship with his children, about whether he was sacrificing too much for a story that might be impossible to prove to the satisfaction of mainstream publishers and readers. And some worried about his safety, because Danny himself had begun to express concerns about the risks he was taking. Starting in early 1991, about 6 months before his death, Danny began making comments that struck his associates as unusual. He told his brother, Tony Casolaro, that if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be an accident or suicide. He made similar statements to several friends and sources. He seemed increasingly aware that the people and organizations he was investigating were not the kind to passively accept exposure. These were individuals and networks with the resources and ruthlessness to protect themselves. If they felt sufficiently threatened, if they believed Danny was getting too close to secrets they couldn't afford to have revealed, what might they do? Danny's brother later recalled a conversation from that spring where Danny had been unusually direct about his fears. "If something happens to me," Danny had said, "don't believe it's an accident." When Tony had asked what he meant, Danny had been vague but serious. There were people who wouldn't want his book published, he'd explained. People with a lot to lose. He wasn't being paranoid, he'd insisted. He was being realistic. This was the nature of the story he was pursuing. There were risks, and he needed his family to be aware of them. But despite these concerns, or perhaps because of them, Danny pushed forward with increased urgency in the summer of 1991. He believed he was close to a breakthrough. Several sources had promised him documents that would prove critical aspects of his thesis. He'd been told about a meeting that gave him access to information that would tie everything together, that would transform his collection of intriguing connections and suggestive patterns into concrete proof of criminal conspiracy. This meeting, he told several people, could be the key to everything. The meeting was scheduled for Martinsburg, West Virginia. Martinsburg wasn't a place Danny would normally have had reason to visit. It was a small city of about 15,000 people, located in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, closer to Maryland and Virginia than to the rest of its own state. It was quiet, unremarkable. The kind of place you passed through on your way to somewhere else, unless you had specific business there. But one of Danny's sources had indicated that this was where they could meet, where documents could be exchanged, where introductions could be made to other individuals with knowledge of the octopus. Danny prepared carefully for the trip. In the days before he left, he told multiple people about where he was going and why. He told his brother Tony that he was traveling to West Virginia to meet intelligence sources who had promised him crew information about the octopus. He told Lynn Knowles, a friend and fellow researcher who'd been helping him with aspects of the investigation, that this trip could provide the final pieces he needed to complete his book. He told Bill Hamilton, the founder of Inslaw and one of Danny's primary sources, that he expected to return with documentation that would blow the whole story open. He was excited, energized. According to everyone who spoke with him in the final days before the trip, Danny showed no signs of depression, no indication that he was contemplating suicide. To the contrary, he seemed optimistic, confident, like a man on the verge of achieving something he'd worked toward for years. He talked about finishing the book, about the impact it would have, about finally getting the recognition he deserved. He talked about his children, about being able to provide for them better once the book money came through. He made plans for after his return, scheduling meetings and promising to share what he'd learned. On August 8, 1991, Danny drove from his Virginia townhouse to Martinsburg, West Virginia. A journey of roughly 70 miles that should have taken about an hour and a half. He checked into the Sheraton Inn sometime that Thursday afternoon, paying cash for the room, signing the register as a guest planning to stay for several nights. The hotel staff would later describe him as appearing normal, perhaps a bit preoccupied but not distressed. He carried a briefcase and what appeared to be several folders of documents. He asked about quiet places to meet people in the hotel, inquiring about the restaurant and lounge areas, whether there were conference rooms available for small meetings. What happened over the next 36 hours remains largely unknown. Danny apparently met with someone or multiple someones during his time in Martinsburg. though who those individuals were and what transpired during their meetings has never been definitively established. He made several phone calls from his hotel room, though records of those calls have been difficult to obtain and interpret. He may have left the hotel at some point, though witnesses' memories of seeing him outside the property are inconsistent and unreliable. The basic facts of his movements during this crucial window of time have been lost or obscured, leaving only speculation and competing theories. What is known with certainty is that sometime between the evening of Friday, August 9th, and the morning of Saturday, August 10th, Danny Casolaro died in the bathtub of room 517. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy would eventually rule the death a suicide, determining that the wounds on Danny's wrists were self-inflicted and that no evidence of foul play could be found. The police investigation, such as it was, accepted this conclusion and closed the case with minimal follow-up. But from the very beginning, Danny's family rejected this version of events. When Tony Casolaro received the call informing him of his brother's death, his immediate reaction was disbelief followed by a certainty that something was terribly wrong. Danny hadn't killed himself. Danny had been murdered. And the people responsible were the same people Danny had been investigating, the members of the Octopus who couldn't afford to let his book see publication. The family's insistence on foul play wasn't based solely on their emotional refusal to accept suicide. As details about the death scene emerged, numerous inconsistencies and irregularities became apparent, elements that seemed to support the conclusion that Danny's death was not what it appeared to be. The wounds on Danny's wrists were described in the medical examiner's report as deep and numerous. According to the autopsy, there were between 10 and 12 distinct cuts on his arms, slicing through tendons and penetrating to significant depth. The official interpretation was that Danny had made multiple attempts, cutting again and again until he succeeded in severing the blood vessels sufficiently to cause fatal blood loss. But experts in suicide methodology later questioned this interpretation. Most individuals who commit suicide by cutting their wrists make 1 or 2 deep cuts. The pain and shock of severing tendons typically prevents the kind of repeated slashing described in Danny's case. The number and depth of his wounds struck some forensic specialists as more consistent with defensive injuries, or wounds inflicted by another person rather than self-inflicted cuts. Moreover, Danny was found fully clothed in the bathtub. While this isn't impossible in a suicide, it's unusual. Most people who kill themselves in bathtubs undress partially or completely, both for comfort and to ensure that wet clothing doesn't impede the bleeding. Danny's clothes were soaked with water and blood, his body positioned in a way that some observers felt looked staged rather than natural. The razor blades found at the scene's additional questions. There were multiple blades scattered on the bathroom floor, as if Danny had used several different implements during the act. But Danny's fingerprints were not found on all of the blades, an anomaly that was never satisfactorily explained. Additionally, some of the blood spatter patterns didn't seem entirely consistent with self-inflicted wounds, though the evidence on this point was ambiguous enough that it could be interpreted in multiple ways. Then there were the so-called suicide notes. These were described as typed documents found in the bathroom, though their exact contents were never fully released to the public, and the family was not given access to them until much later. The portions that were shared seemed generic, lacking the personal specificity that characterizes most genuine suicide notes. There was no mention of Danny's children, no messages for his family, no explanation for why he would take his own life at this particular moment. The language felt impersonal, almost formulaic, more like someone trying to create the appearance of a suicide note than an actual final communication from someone in genuine psychological distress. Furthermore, Danny's briefcase and documents, the materials he'd brought with him to Martinsburg for his meetings, were missing. According to people familiar with Danny's work habits, he never traveled without his research materials, especially when meeting sources. He would have had notebooks, files, possibly drafts of chapters from his book. Yet when investigators cataloged the contents of his hotel room, these materials were nowhere to be found. The briefcase was gone. His notes were gone. Everything related to his investigation into the octopus had disappeared. The handling of the death scene by local authorities also struck many observers as problematic. The room was not treated as a potential crime scene, despite the unusual circumstances. Evidence was not collected with the thoroughness that a suspicious death would typically warrant. Danny's body was embalmed before his family even knew he was dead, destroying potential forensic evidence and preventing a second, independent autopsy that might have resolved some of the medical questions surrounding his death. When Tony Casolaro arrived in Martinsburg to identify his brother and collect his belongings, he found that crucial decisions had already been made, that potential evidence had already been lost, that the investigation, if it could be called that, had already moved toward its predetermined conclusion. The speed with which Danny's body was embalmed became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Standard procedure in cases of unexpected death, particularly when there are questions about the circumstances, is to preserve the body in its original state until family members have been notified and all necessary examinations have been completed. Yet within hours of the discovery of Danny's body, before his family had even been contacted, the remains were released to a local funeral home and embalmed. This irreversible process destroyed blood samples, tissue samples, and other biological evidence that could have been crucial in determining whether Danny had been drugged, whether the wounds on his wrists showed signs of restraint or struggle, whether there were other indicators of foul play that a more thorough autopsy might have revealed. When Tony Casolaro questioned why this had happened so quickly, he received explanations that struck him as inadequate and evasive. He was told that it was standard procedure, that there was no reason to delay, that the cause of death seemed obvious. But Tony knew that nothing about Danny's death was obvious, and the haste to process and prepare the body felt less like efficiency and more like the deliberate destruction of evidence. The Martinsburg police investigation, such as it was, lasted only a few days. Detective Sergeant Randolph Boone was assigned to the case, and his report reflects an investigation that accepted the suicide conclusion almost from the outset. Boone interviewed hotel staff, reviewed the room, spoke briefly with family members, and consulted with the medical examiner. But he did not pursue leads that might have complicated the suicide narrative. He did not thoroughly investigate who Danny had been meeting in Martinsburg. He did not attempt to recover Danny's missing briefcase and documents. He did not question why a man who had been described by everyone who knew him as excited and optimistic would suddenly kill himself in such a brutal manner. When family members and friends pressed for more thorough investigation, they encountered resistance. The case was closed. The medical examiner had ruled it suicide. There was no evidence of foul play. These were the answers they received, repeated like a mantra, as if repetition could transform an inadequate investigation into a satisfactory one. But Danny's associates refused to let the matter rest. They began conducting their own investigation, reaching out to Danny's sources, reviewing his research, trying to reconstruct what he'd been working on in the final months of his life. What they discovered only deepened their conviction that Danny had been murdered to silence him. Bill Hamilton, the founder of Inslaw, became one of the most vocal advocates for a thorough investigation into Danny's death. Hamilton had worked closely with Danny, providing him with documents and contacts related to the PRMS software case. He'd been one of the last people Danny had spoken with before leaving for Martinsburg, and Danny had told him explicitly that he expected this trip to provide crucial evidence. Hamilton was convinced that Danny had been getting too close to something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, that his death was not a coincidence but an assassination carried out to protect the octopus. Lynn Knowles, who had been helping Danny with research, had similar convictions. She'd seen Danny's notes, had heard his theories, had watched him piece together connections that seemed to point toward something genuinely sinister. She didn't believe Danny was delusional or paranoid. She believed he was onto something real, something dangerous, and that he'd paid the ultimate price for his investigation. As word of Danny's death spread through the network of journalists, researchers, and whistleblowers who'd been following his work, a consensus began to emerge among those who'd known him. This wasn't suicide. This was murder, and the very fact that authorities were so quick to accept the suicide explanation, so resistant to deeper investigation, suggested that the cover-up Danny had been investigating extended even to his own death. The alternative media and conspiracy research communities seized on Danny's death as proof of the very conspiracies he'd been investigating. Articles appeared in publications that mainstream media wouldn't touch, laying out the case for murder, connecting Danny's death to other suspicious deaths of journalists and whistleblowers, suggesting that America was governed not by elected officials but by a shadow network that eliminated threats with impunity. Danny became a martyr, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens to those who dig too deep into forbidden territories. But to understand why Danny's death provoked such intense reaction, why it became a touchstone for conspiracy theorists and anti-government activists, we need to understand what Danny had actually been investigating. We need to examine the octopus itself, or at least the version of it that Danny had constructed from his research. We need to look at the connections he'd drawn, the evidence he'd accumulated, the story he'd been trying to tell. At the center of Danny's investigation was the PRMS software case, and it's here that we need to begin unraveling the tangled web that consumed the last years of his life. GROMS, the Prosecutor's Management Information System, was developed in the late 1970s by a company called Inslaw, which was run by Bill and Nancy Hamilton. The software was designed to help prosecutors' offices track cases, manage evidence, coordinate court dates, and generally handle the massive data management challenges that came with running large legal departments. It was sophisticated for its time, utilizing database architecture that was far ahead of most commercial software available in that era. The Justice Department contracted with Inslaw to implement PRMS in U.S. attorneys' offices across the country, and initially the relationship between the government and the company seemed productive. But according to the Hamiltons, something went wrong. They claimed that in the early 1980s, officials within the Justice Department, particularly individuals connected to a General Edwin Meese, conspired to steal the PRMS software. The alleged scheme involved forcing Inslaw into bankruptcy through various bureaucratic and financial pressures, then claiming that the software belonged to the government rather than the company. Once they had control of PRMS, these officials allegedly modified the software, adding backdoors and surveillance capabilities, then distributed it to various domestic and foreign agencies, using it as a tool for intelligence gathering. The Hamiltons sued the Justice Department, and their case became a years-long legal battle that involved allegations of conspiracy, theft of intellectual property, and obstruction of justice. An independent investigation by former Attorney General Elliot Richardson, conducted at the request of Congress, eventually concluded that the Hamiltons' allegations had merit, that there was evidence of wrongdoing by Justice Department officials, that PRMS had been stolen and distributed improperly. But despite these findings, no criminal charges were ever filed, and Inslaw never received adequate compensation for the theft of their software. This was the starting point for Danny's investigation. But as he dug deeper into the PRMS case, he began to see connections to other events and scandals that seemed too significant to be coincidental. One connection involved a shadowy figure named Michael Riconosciuto. Riconosciuto was a peculiar character, a self-described computer programmer and intelligence operative who claimed to have worked on covert projects for various government agencies. He had a background in chemistry and electronics, and he moved in circles that included both legitimate defense contractors and individuals involved in organized crime and drug trafficking. Riconosciuto told Danny that he had personally modified the PRMS software, adding the backdoor capabilities that allowed intelligence agencies to spy on users. He claimed that this modified version had been sold or given to foreign governments, including Canada, Israel, Iraq, and South Korea, allowing American intelligence to monitor the computer systems of both allies and adversaries. Riconosciuto's claims were explosive but difficult to verify. He had a criminal history that included drug charges, and his credibility was questionable. But he provided Danny with technical details about the software modifications that seemed to demonstrate genuine knowledge of PRMS's architecture. He also connected the PRMIS case to other covert operations, including weapons testing on the Cabazon Indian Reservation in California, a story that involved tribal corruption, organized crime, and alleged illegal arms sales. The Cabazon connection was one of the tentacles of the octopus that fascinated Danny. The Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, a small tribe in Southern California, had gotten involved in various business ventures in the 1980s, some of which allegedly served as fronts for illegal weapons development and intelligence operations. According to sources Danny interviewed, the reservation's sovereign status made it an ideal location for activities that would be illegal if conducted on regular American territory. Weapons could be tested, modified, and manufactured without the usual regulatory oversight. Connections existed between the tribal operations and organized crime figures, and possibly to intelligence agencies looking for deniable ways to develop weapons for covert operations. Two men who'd been involved in investigating the Cabazon operations had died under suspicious circumstances before Danny began his research. Fred Alvarez, a Cabazon tribal leader who'd spoken out against the weapons programs, was found murdered. Paul Marasca, an investigator looking into the tribal corruption, died in what was ruled a suicide but which his family disputed. These deaths became part of the larger pattern that Danny saw emerging, a trail of bodies connected to the octopus, evidence that the conspiracy was willing to kill to protect its secrets. From the Cabazon case, Danny's investigation led him to examine the October Surprise allegations. This was one of the most controversial political scandals of the 1980s, involving claims that representatives of Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign had secretly negotiated with Iranian officials to delay the release of American hostages held in Tehran until after the election, sabotaging President Jimmy Carter's chances for re-election. The hostages were released on January 20, 1981, the exact day Reagan was inaugurated, a timing that many found suspicious. Danny believed that some of the same individuals involved in the PRMIS theft were also connected to the October Surprise. He saw links between covert intelligence operations, arms dealing, and political manipulation that suggested a network operating across multiple scandals. The evidence was fragmentary and circumstantial, but the pattern seemed too consistent to ignore. Similarly, Danny connected the octopus to the Iran-Contra affair, the scandal that erupted in 1986 when it was revealed that members of the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran and used the proceeds to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, in violation of congressional prohibitions. Danny believed that Iran-Contra wasn't an isolated incident but rather one manifestation of a larger octopus, part of a pattern of covert operations that bypassed democratic oversight and served the interests of a shadow network. Another tentacle reached toward the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. This Pakistani-based bank collapsed in 1991, just months before Danny's death, amid revelations of massive fraud, money laundering, and connections to trafficking, arms dealing, and intelligence agencies from multiple countries. BCCI was described by investigators as one of the most corrupt financial institutions in history, a bank that had essentially operated as a criminal enterprise while maintaining the facade of legitimate international banking. Danny saw BCC as the financial engine of the octopus, the institution that moved money between the various criminal operations he was investigating. The scope of Danny's theory was breathtaking. He wasn't just alleging a single conspiracy, but rather a meta-conspiracy, a network that connected numerous criminal enterprises and covert operations across decades. The octopus, as he conceived it, included rogue intelligence operatives, corrupt Justice Department officials, organized crime figures, crook politicians, and corporate criminals, all working together or in parallel to enrich themselves and consolidate power outside the boundaries of legal authority. To skeptics, this sounded like classic conspiracy theory, the kind of pattern seeking that sees connections everywhere, that mistakes correlation for causation, that weaves together unrelated events into grand narratives that feel compelling but lack solid proof. The human mind is excellent at finding patterns, even when patterns don't exist. We're meaning-making creatures, and when we encounter complex events, we naturally try to organize them into coherent stories. Conspiracy theories often arise from this tendency, taking the chaos and randomness of history and imposing order on it. suggesting that someone is in control, that events happen according to plan rather than through the interaction of countless independent actors and random chance. But Danny's defenders argue that his theory wasn't baseless pattern seeking. He wasn't connecting random dots. He was following evidence, documenting relationships between individuals who appeared in multiple scandals, tracing money flows, recording testimony from sources who claimed direct knowledge of criminal operations. Yes, his theory was vast and complex, but maybe that was because the reality it described was vast and complex. Maybe the octopus was real. The challenge Danny faced was one that confronts any journalist investigating powerful institutions and individuals. How do you prove a conspiracy? By its nature, criminal conspiracy involves secrecy, deception, and the active concealment of evidence. The people involved aren't voluntarily confess or provide documentation of their crimes. They're going to deny, deflect, and destroy evidence. They're going to use their resources and connections to discredit investigators and suppress revelations. And if they're as powerful as Danny believed the octopus was, they might be willing to kill to protect their secrets. This is where the line between legitimate investigative journalism and paranoid conspiracy theorizing becomes difficult to draw. How much evidence is enough? How many coincidences constitute a pattern? At what point does healthy skepticism toward official narratives become unhealthy paranoia? Danny was trying to navigate these questions in the final months of his life, trying to gather enough documentation to prove his case, while avoiding the trap of seeing conspiracies where none existed. His methods were thorough but also reflected the limitations of an independent journalist working without the resources of a major news organization. He couldn't subpoena documents or compel testimony. He couldn't conduct forensic accounting or deploy teams of researchers. He had to rely on what sources would voluntarily provide, on what documents happened to leak, on connections he could establish through interviews and public records. It was painstaking work, and the picture that emerged was necessarily incomplete. Danny's notebooks from this period, which his family eventually recovered, show a mind trying to organize massive amounts of information into coherent narrative. He created timelines stretching back to the 1940s, identifying what he believed were the origins of the octopus in post-World War II intelligence operations. He drew diagrams connecting individuals across different scandals, showing how the same names kept appearing in different contexts. He compiled lists of suspicious deaths, people connected to his investigation who died under circumstances that seemed questionable. Some of these connections seemed genuinely significant. It was verifiable that certain individuals had been involved in multiple scandals, that relationships existed between people who appeared in the PR Ames case and Iran-Contra, that money had flowed through BC of various questionable operations. These weren't fantasies. These were documented facts, however much debate might exist about their interpretation. Other connections were more tenuous, based on second-hand accounts or circumstantial evidence that could support multiple interpretations. Danny's sources included people with serious credibility issues, individuals who made dramatic claims that couldn't be independently verified. Michael Riconosciuto, for instance, was facing drug charges and had motivations to exaggerate his own importance in various operations. Other sources were anonymous, providing information that might be true but might also be disinformation, attempts to mislead Danny or discredit him. Danny was aware of these problems. His notes show him questioning his sources, trying to corroborate claims, being skeptical about information that seemed too convenient or dramatic. But he was also under pressure. He'd spent years on this investigation, had invested enormous amounts of time and money, had promised a book that would expose one of the greatest conspiracies in American history. The pressure to find proof, to make all the pieces fit, must have been intense. In the spring and summer of 1991, Danny seemed to believe he was on the verge of breakthrough. He told multiple people that he was close to getting documents that would prove the conspiracy. He mentioned a source who was ready to come forward with inside information. He talked about the Martinsburg meeting as if it would be the culmination of his investigation, the moment when everything would finally come together. Looking back, some of Danny's associates wondered if he'd been set up, If the octopus was real and felt threatened by his investigation, what better way to deal with him than to lure him to a meeting with promises of crucial evidence, then kill him in a way that could be made to look like suicide? The isolated hotel in a small West Virginia town would be the perfect location for such an operation. Danny would come willingly, expecting to meet sources. He could be murdered, the scene staged, his research materials stolen, and local authorities could be counted on to accept the obvious explanation without digging too deep. This scenario requires believing in a conspiracy sophisticated enough to orchestrate Danny's murder and cover it up, which brings us back to the fundamental question about the octopus itself. Was it real? Was there actually a vast criminal network operating within the U.S. government, or was Danny pursuing shadows, connecting dots that had no meaningful connection? The truth, as with most complex questions, likely lies somewhere between the extremes. Were there criminal conspiracies operating within elements of the U.S. government during the 1980s? Absolutely. Iran-Contra proved that beyond any doubt. Were there corrupt officials willing to abuse their power for personal gain? The Hermes case suggests yes, even if the full extent of the theft and distribution remains debated. Was BCCI a massively corrupt institution with intelligence agencies? This is established fact, admitted even by official investigations. But did all of these separate instances of corruption and criminality constitute a single unified conspiracy, an octopus coordinating operations across decades? This is much harder to establish. Corruption and covert operations can be endemic without being coordinated. Multiple bad actors can operate in parallel without being part of a grand design. The appearance of connection might reflect overlapping networks of corrupt individuals rather than a hierarchical conspiracy. Danny believed evidence of the unified conspiracy, but he died before he could present that evidence in comprehensive form. His book was never completed. His research materials disappeared. What we're left with is fragments, testimony from people who spoke with him, notes that sketch out his theories without fully documenting them, and a death that his family and supporters insist was murder while authorities classified as suicide. In the months following Danny's death, several journalists and researchers attempted to pick up where he'd left off. They interviewed his sources, reviewed what remained of his research, tried to reconstruct his investigation. Some of this work appeared in alternative media outlets, in publications that were willing to entertain conspiracy theories that mainstream media dismissed. The results were mixed. Some intriguing connections were documented. Some of Danny's sources provided information that seemed to support aspects of his theory. But the smoking gun, the definitive proof of the octopus, remained elusive. One of the most significant follow-up investigations was conducted by a journalist named Ken Thomas, who wrote extensively about Danny's death and the octopus theory. Thomas interviewed many of Danny's sources and compiled documentation that supported at least some of Danny's claims. But even Thomas had to acknowledge that proving the full extent of the conspiracy Danny had envisioned remained difficult, that much of the evidence was circumstantial, that alternative explanations existed for many of the connections Danny had identified. Similarly, a researcher named Cherry Seymour spent years investigating the Cabazon Indian Reservation case, and its connections to the wider had been exploring. Her work, published under the name The Last Circle, provided substantial documentation of criminal activities on the reservations to organized crime. But again, while this validated some of Danny's research, it didn't prove the existence of the unified octopus he'd theorized. The mainstream media largely ignored Danny's death and the questions surrounding it. When it was mentioned at all, it was typically dismissed as the sad end of a journalist who'd gone down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. The implication was that Danny had become unstable, obsessed, perhaps paranoid, and that his suicide was the tragic but understandable result of mental illness rather than evidence of conspiracy. This dismissal infuriated Danny's family and supporters. They saw it as part of the cover-up, evidence that mainstream media was either complicit in the octopus or too timid to investigate it seriously. The fact that major newspapers and television networks wouldn't touch the story was, to them, confirmation that Danny had been onto something that powerful interests wanted suppressed. But the alternative explanation is that mainstream media didn't cover Danny's death extensively because there wasn't sufficient evidence to support the murder theory. Because the story as presented by conspiracy theorists relied too heavily on speculation and unverified claims. Because professional journalism requires standards of proof that Danny's investigation, however sincere and thorough by his own lights, didn't meet. This tension between alternative and mainstream media coverage of Danny's case reflects broader divisions in how Americans think about government, power, and truth. To conspiracy theorists, mainstream media is compromised, unwilling, or unable to report on genuine conspiracies because of its connections to the powers being investigated. To mainstream journalists, conspiracy theorists are unreliable, prone to seeing patterns that don't exist, willing to accept flimsy evidence because it confirms their pre-existing beliefs about how the world works. Danny's case became a Rorschach test. What you saw in it depended largely on what you brought to it. If you believe that vast criminal conspiracies operated within government, Danny's death was obvious murder and his investigation was getting close to explosive truths. If you believe that conspiracy theories were generally false, and that most apparent patterns were coincidence, Danny's death was a sad suicide by a man who'd lost perspective on his investigation. The official investigation into Danny's death remained closed. The Martinsburg police maintained that they'd found no evidence of foul play. The medical examiner's suicide ruling stood. Despite pressure from Danny's family and from some members of Congress who'd taken an interest in the case, no federal investigation was launched. No grand jury was convened. No serious attempt was made to resolve the questions that had been raised. Congressman Jack Brooks of Texas, who chaired the House Judiciary Committee, did hold hearings related to the PRMS software case and the wider allegations of Justice Department corruption that Danny had been investigating. These hearings, conducted in the early 1990s, touched on some of the issues Danny had explored, but they didn't focus on Danny's death, and they ultimately produced no criminals or major revelations. The testimony was contradictory, and the political will to pursue serious consequences apparently absent. In 1992, Attorney General William Barr asked retired federal judge Nicholas Boa to conduct an independent investigation into the PRMS case. The Boa report, released in 1993, concluded that while there had been some improper handling of the Inslaw contract, there was no evidence of a criminal conspiracy to steal the software or distribute it to intelligence agencies. The report was thorough in some respects, dismissing many of the more dramatic allegations that Danny and others had made. But critics of the Boa report noted that it relied heavily on testimony from Justice Department officials who had motivation to deny wrongdoing, that it dismissed or discredited witnesses who claimed knowledge of the conspiracy, and that it didn't adequately address some of the documentary evidence that suggested misconduct. The report felt like a whitewash to those who believed in the octopus, confirmation that the cover-up extended even to supposedly independent investigations. The Senate also conducted investigations related to BCCI and its connections to intelligence operations. These investigations, led by Senator John Kerry among others, revealed extensive criminal activity by the bank and documented connections to drug trafficking, arms dealing, and money laundering. But again, while this validated some of what Danny had been investigating, it didn't prove the unified conspiracy he'd theorized, and it didn't resolve questions about his death. As the 1990s progressed and no definitive resolution emerged, Danny's case began to fade from public attention. It remained a touchstone for conspiracy researchers, a case study in alleged government murder and cover-up that was referenced in books and articles exploring various conspiracy theories. But for most Americans, if they'd heard of Danny Casolaro at all, he was at best a footnote, a minor figure in the complex and often confusing scandals of the Reagan and Bush years. Danny's children grew up without their father, carrying with them the weight of unanswered questions and competing narratives about how he died. For them, Danny wasn't a conspiracy theorist or a martyred journalist or a case study in the dangers of investigative obsession. He was simply Dad, a man they'd loved and lost under circumstances that would never be fully explained to them. The controversy surrounding his death became part of their inheritance. a burden they hadn't asked for but couldn't escape, Tony Casolaro never wavered in his belief that his brother had been murdered. For the rest of his life, he fought for official recognition that Danny's death deserved serious investigation, that the suicide ruling was inadequate and possibly fraudulent. He gave interviews to journalists, corresponded with researchers, provided what materials from Danny's investigation he could access to anyone who seemed serious about pursuing the truth. But Tony was fighting against institutional inertia, against the tendency of official narratives to harden into accepted fact regardless of how many questions remained unanswered. The physical evidence from Danny's death, what little remained after the hasty embalming and cursory investigation, was eventually released to the family. They examined it with experts, looking for anything that might definitively prove murder. The autopsy photos were disturbing, showing the extent of the wounds on Danny's wrists and arms. Medical professionals consulted by the family had varying opinions. Some felt the injuries were consistent with suicide, however brutal. Others questioned whether a person could have inflicted such extensive damage on themselves, particularly given the depth and number of cuts. The razor blades remained a point of contention. The fact that Danny's fingerprints weren't found on all of them suggested to some that another person had been present, that the scene had been staged. But the counter-argument was that blood and water could have obscured prints, that the collection and analysis of fingerprint evidence from the scene had been imperfect. That absence of prints didn't necessarily prove someone else had handled the blades. The missing briefcase and documents were never recovered. This remained one of the most suspicious elements of the entire case. If Danny had killed himself, what happened to his research materials? The argument that he disposed of them before taking his life made little sense. Why would someone planning suicide carefully hide or destroy their work? And if he hadn't disposed of them, who had taken them and why? Various theories emerged about what might have happened to Danny's research. Some speculated that hotel staff had found the materials and, not understanding their significance, had simply discarded them. Others believed that whoever had murdered Danny had taken the materials to prevent his investigation from being completed. Still others suggested that intelligence agencies had confiscated the documents, using their authority to remove evidence that might expose classified operations. What made the situation even more frustrating was that Danny hadn't kept all his research in one place. He'd been careful about that, or at least somewhat careful. Copies of documents existed in his townhouse, in storage, with some of his sources. So while the loss of his briefcase meant that whatever specific materials he'd brought to Martinsburg were gone, the entirety of his investigation wasn't destroyed. Researchers could still access much of what he'd compiled, could still review his theories and evidence. But what was lost was Danny's synthesis, his final organization of the material into coherent narrative. The book he'd been planning would have represented his polished and comprehensive presentation of the octopus theory. Whatever he'd learned in Martinsburg, whatever documents he'd been promised or received, whatever breakthroughs he'd made in his final days, all of that was gone. Reconstructing his investigation from the fragments that remained was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces and no picture to guide the assembly. In the years following Danny's death, several books were published that dealt with his investigation, or with related conspiracies. Jim Huggins' Secret Agenda explored covert operations and intelligence community corruption in ways that touched on themes Danny had been investigating. Ken Thomas and David Hatcher's The Octopus, Secret Government and the Death of Danny Casolaro attempted to present Danny's theories and argue for the murder conclusion. Cherry Seymour's The Last Circle provided extensive documentation of the Cabazon case and its connections to organized crime and intelligence operations. These books kept Danny's name alive in alternative research communities, but they didn't break through to mainstream awareness. They were published by small presses, reviewed in alternative media, purchased by people already inclined to believe in government conspiracies. They preached to the converted rather than persuading skeptics. Part of the challenge was that the octopus theory, as Danny had conceived it, was simply too vast and complex for easy communication. Explaining it required laying out multiple scandals, establishing connections between dozens of individuals, tracing money flows and covert operations across decades and continents. Even sympathetic readers could get lost in the details, could lose track of how all the pieces supposedly fit together. And for skeptical readers, the sheer scope of the alleged conspiracy seemed to undermine its credibility. How could something so massive remain hidden? How could so many people be involved without someone providing definitive proof? This is a common problem with conspiracy theories that allege vast, coordinated criminal networks. The bigger the conspiracy, the more people who would need to be involved, and the more people involved, the harder it becomes to maintain secrecy. Someone talks, someone provides documentation. Someone has an attack of conscience or sees an opportunity for personal gain by exposing the conspiracy. Yet in Danny's case, while there were sources who claimed knowledge of various aspects of the octopus, no one had come forward with the kind of comprehensive, documented proof that would convince mainstream institutions to take the allegations seriously. The counter-argument, of course, is that people had tried to come forward and had been ignored, discredited, or silenced. Danny himself could be seen as someone who tried to expose the conspiracy and was murdered for it. Other sources had faced legal problems, had been charged with crimes that might have been pretextual attempts to destroy their credibility. The system, according to this view, was designed to protect itself, to prevent exposure even when whistleblowers tried to reveal the truth. Michael Riconosciuto, Danny's source who'd claimed to have modified the PRMS software, was arrested on drug charges just days after providing an affidavit to Congress about the software case. The timing seems suspicious to conspiracy theorists. Evidence that Riconosciuto was being silenced or punished for cooperating with investigations. But prosecutors argued that Riconosciuto was simply a drug dealer who'd been under investigation independent of his claims about PRMS, that his arrest had nothing to do with his testimony, that he was trying to present himself as a political prisoner to avoid consequences for legitimate crimes. This pattern repeated across multiple sources and witnesses connected to Danny's investigation. People who claimed knowledge of the octopus frequently had credibility problems. They had criminal records. They made claims that couldn't be verified. They told contradictory stories. They seemed motivated by desire for attention or immunity from prosecution. Sorting out which of these sources were genuine whistleblowers and which were con artists or mentally unstable individuals proved nearly impossible. Danny himself had struggled with this problem. His notes show him trying to evaluate his sources, being aware that some might be unreliable. But he'd also become invested in the investigation, had built a framework of understanding that interpreted ambiguous evidence in particular ways. Confirmation bias is a powerful force. Once we've formed a theory about how the world works, we tend to notice evidence that supports our theory and discount evidence that contradicts it. This isn't intentional dishonesty. It's a fundamental feature of human cognition. And Danny, after years of investigating the octopus, may have fallen into the trap of seeing everything through the lens of his theory, interpreting ambiguous events in ways that confirmed his pre-existing beliefs. But does that mean the octopus wasn't real? Or does it just mean that proving it was harder than Danny hoped? The challenge with evaluating his investigation is that absence of proof isn't proof of absence. Just because Danny couldn't definitively prove the vast conspiracy he'd theorized doesn't mean that no conspiracy existed. It might simply mean that the conspiracy was effective at concealing itself, that the proof Danny needed was too well hidden or protected, that his murder prevented him from obtaining the final pieces of evidence. This is the epistemological trap that conspiracy theories create. They're structured in ways that make them unfalsifiable. Evidence that supports the theory is taken as proof. Evidence that contradicts the theory is dismissed as disinformation or cover-up. Absence of evidence is explained as the conspiracy's effectiveness at concealing itself. No matter what happens, the theory can accommodate it, can explain it in ways that preserve the central narrative. Skeptics point to this feature as evidence that conspiracy theories are fundamentally flawed, that they're belief systems rather than rational interpretations of evidence. Believers counter that this skepticism plays into the hands of conspirators, that institutional power benefits when citizens dismiss allegations of wrongdoing as mere conspiracy theories, that the label conspiracy theorist has been weaponized to discredit legitimate investigation. Danny's case sits at the intersection of these debates. Was he a careful investigator pursuing genuine evidence of criminal conspiracy, murdered because he got too close to explosive truths? Or was he a well-meaning journalist who became obsessed with patterns that didn't reflect coordinated conspiracy, who tragically took his own life when the stress of his investigation became overwhelming? The evidence can be marshaled to support either interpretation, and which one you find persuasive probably depends largely on your prior beliefs about government power and the likelihood of vast conspiracies. What seems beyond dispute is that Danny was sincere. He genuinely believed he was onto something important. He wasn't a grifter trying to make money from conspiracy theories. He was a journalist who became convinced that he'd uncovered evidence of serious crimes and who felt obligated to expose them. Whether that conviction was justified by the evidence he'd gathered, whether his investigation was sound, or had become distorted by confirmation bias and unreliable sources, these are questions we can debate. But his sincerity, his belief that he was doing important work, seems clear. The question of whether he killed himself is separate from the question of whether the octopus was real. Even if we grant that Danny's investigation was flawed, that some of his sources were unreliable, that his theory had outpaced his evidence, it still doesn't necessarily follow that he committed suicide. A person can be wrong about a conspiracy theory, but still be murdered for other reasons. Or a person can be right about a conspiracy and still suffer from depression that leads to suicide. The truth about Danny's investigation and the truth about his death aren't necessarily the same truth. In 1994, 3 years after Danny's death, his brother Tony managed to get the case reopened for a brief period. A second medical examiner reviewed the autopsy materials and the photographs from the death scene. This examiner raised additional questions about the suicide ruling, noting inconsistencies in the wound patterns and expressing skepticism that a person could have inflicted such extensive injuries on themselves. But ultimately, this review didn't lead to a change in the official determination. The case was closed again with the suicide ruling standing. The problem was that too much time had passed. Too much evidence had been lost or compromised. Even if investigators had wanted to seriously pursue the murder theory, the trail had gone cold. Hotel staff had scattered. Potential witnesses had faded into anonymity. The physical evidence had been destroyed by the embalming. Danny's missing document gone, presumably forever. A serious investigation in August 1991, immediately after the death, might have been able to establish what really happened. But an investigation 3 years later was trying to reconstruct events from degraded and incomplete information. Danny's family eventually filed a lawsuit seeking to force a more thorough official investigation. The suit alleged that authorities had been negligent in their handling of the case, that the hasty embalming and cursory investigation had denied the family their right to know the truth about how Danny died. But the lawsuit faced substantial legal obstacles. Qualified immunity protected many of the officials involved. Statutes of limitations had expired for some potential claims. And fundamentally, the family was trying to prove a negative, that the investigation had been inadequate, without being able to definitively prove what a more thorough investigation would have discovered. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed. The family had exhausted their legal options. All that remained was to continue pressing for public attention, to keep Danny's story alive, to hope that eventually someone would come forward with information that might resolve the questions that haunted them. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the internet became more widely accessible, Danny's case found new life online. Websites dedicated to conspiracy research featured extensive materials about his investigation and death. Discussion forums debated the evidence. Amateur investigators pored over documents and photographs, developing elaborate theories about what had happened. The democratization of information that the internet enabled meant that Danny's story could reach audiences far beyond what would have been possible through traditional media. But this also meant that Danny's case became intermixed with other, less credible conspiracy theories. Websites that discussed his death also promoted theories about alien cover-ups, faked moon landings, and various other claims that serious researchers found embarrassing. The association between Danny's case and obvious nonsense may have actually hurt efforts to get his investigation taken seriously by mainstream institutions. If you were a journalist or official considering whether to look into Danny's death, and your research led you to websites that also claimed the government was hiding crashed UFOs, or that the world was run by reptilian shapeshifters, you might reasonably conclude that this wasn't serious material worth your time. This remains one of the challenges for anyone investigating Danny's case today. The legitimate questions about his death have been so thoroughly mixed with outlandish conspiracy theories that sorting out what deserves serious consideration from what's obvious fantasy requires careful attention and critical thinking. And most people, reasonably enough, don't want to invest that kind of effort. It's easier to dismiss the whole thing as conspiracy nonsense than to carefully evaluate which aspects of the case merit serious investigation. Yet periodically, mainstream attention does return to Danny's case, usually prompted by new revelations about government scandals that echo themes from his investigation. When documents about Iran-Contra were declassified, when details about BCCI's criminal operations became public, when new information about covert operations emerged, journalists would sometimes remember Danny Casolaro and wonder whether he'd been onto something after all. In 2001, The Washington Post published an article revisiting Danny's death and investigation. The piece was relatively balanced, presenting both the murder theory and the suicide explanation, interviewing people on both sides of the debate. It didn't reach definitive conclusions but treated the case as a legitimate mystery worth examining rather than dismissing it as conspiracy fantasy. For Danny's family and supporters, this felt like vindication, evidence that serious journalists recognized the questions surrounding his death deserved attention. But the article didn't lead to reopened investigations or new revelations. It was a moment of attention that faded as the news cycle moved on. Danny's case remained unresolved, his death officially classified as suicide despite the doubts that persisted. One aspect of Danny's investigation that has received somewhat more mainstream acceptance over the years is the PRMA software case itself. Even skeptics of the broader octopus theory generally acknowledge that something improper happened with PRMAS, that Inslaw was treated badly by the Justice Department, that the software was likely distributed beyond what proper licensing would have allowed. The debate isn't whether misconduct occurred, but rather about the scale and nature of that misconduct. Bill Hamilton, Inslaw's founder, continued to fight for recognition of what had been done to his company until his death in 2024. He never stopped believing that PRMS had been stolen and weaponized as a surveillance tool, that Danny had been murdered while investigating this theft. That justice had been denied both to Inslaw and to Danny's family. Hamilton's persistence kept the case alive in certain circles, providing a continuing link to the events Danny had been investigating. The question of whether PRMS was actually modified with backdoors and distributed to foreign governments remains contentious. Some intelligence community sources have confirmed that modified versions of the software were indeed used for surveillance purposes, that the capability to monitor other governments' computer systems through compromised software was valuable and was exploited. But official acknowledgement of such programs remains limited, and much of what's been said comes from anonymous sources or from individuals whose credibility is disputed. In 2020, a series of revelations about a Swiss encryption company called Crypto AG provided an interesting parallel to Danny's PRMS allegations. It was revealed that Crypto AG had been secretly owned by the CIA and German intelligence for decades, and that the encryption devices the company sold to governments around the world had been deliberately weakened to allow American and German intelligence to read supposedly secure communications. This was exactly the kind of operation Danny had theorized was being done with PRMS, selling or distributing compromised technology to gather intelligence. The Crypto AG revelation suggested that Danny's core suspicion, that intelligence agencies would distribute compromised software to spy on allies and adversaries, wasn't crazy at all. It was, in fact, precisely the kind of operation that intelligence agencies conducted. does this prove that Pyramus was used this way? Not directly. But it establishes that the type of operation Danny alleged was well within the realm of actual intelligence practice, rather than paranoid fantasy. Similarly, ongoing revelations about NSA surveillance programs, particularly those disclosed by Edward Snowden in 2013, demonstrated that the U.S. government was conducting mass surveillance on a scale that would have seemed like conspiracy theory just years earlier. The government was collecting phone records of millions of Americans. It was tapping into internet backbone infrastructure. It was compelling technology companies to provide access to user data. All of this was done in secret with minimal oversight, in ways that many legal scholars believed violated constitutional protections. These revelations didn't prove Danny's specific allegations about the octopus, but they did demonstrate that vast, secret government programs operating outside normal legal constraints were entirely possible. That conspiracy theories about government surveillance had often understated rather than overstated the reality, that skepticism toward official denials was often more justified than trust in government transparency. For those who believed in Danny's investigation, each new scandal, each new revelation about government misconduct felt like vindication. See, they'd say this is exactly what Danny was trying to expose. The government does conduct illegal operations. It does lie about them. It does operate in secret networks that bypass democratic accountability. Danny wasn't crazy, he was ahead of his time. He saw what was happening before most people were willing to believe it. But this argument has limits. Yes, the government has conducted improper surveillance programs. Yes, covert operations have violated laws and norms. Yes, officials have lied and covered up misconduct. None of this proves that Danny's specific allegations about a unified octopus conspiracy were correct. Widespread corruption and multiple instances of misconduct don't necessarily constitute a single coordinated conspiracy. The world can be full of bad actors without there being a grand design coordinating their actions. This is the frustrating thing about Danny's case. We can acknowledge that he was investigating real misconduct, that some of what he suspected has been validated by subsequent revelations, that his skepticism toward official narratives was often justified, and still not be able to definitively say whether his broader theory was correct, or whether he was murdered to silence his investigation. The mystery persists not because of lack of investigation, but because the available evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Smart, honest people examining the same facts reach different conclusions. The suicide ruling might be correct, or it might be a successful cover-up of murder. We may never know with certainty which interpretation is true. What we do know is that Danny Castellaros spent the final years of his life pursuing what he believed was one of the most important stories in American history. He sacrificed his financial security, his time with his children, his personal relationships, his peace of mind, all in service of exposing what he called the octopus. Whether that sacrifice was noble or tragic, whether it was in pursuit of truth or of shadows, depends on questions we still can't definitively answer more than 3 decades after his death. The summer of 1991 was a time of transition in America. The Cold War had ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union looming on the horizon. The Gulf War had been fought and won in a matter of weeks, a display of American military dominance that seemed to herald a new era of unchallenged power. The economy was struggling through recession, and political scandals were erupting with regularity. It was a moment when the certainties of the previous decades felt unstable, when the institutions that had governed American life seemed vulnerable to questioning and critique. In this context, Danny's investigation tapped into broader anxieties about who really controlled the levers of power in America. Was it elected officials operating within constitutional constraints, accountable to voters, or was there a deeper state, a permanent government of intelligence operatives and bureaucrats and connected insiders who pursued their own agendas regardless of who occupied the White House or controlled Congress? This question, which Danny's investigation implicitly posed, resonated with many Americans who felt increasingly disconnected from and skeptical of their government. The concept of the deep state wasn't new in 1991, but it wasn't yet the common term it would become in later decades. Danny didn't use that phrase. He talked about the octopus, about a criminal conspiracy rather than a bureaucratic resistance to democratic control. But the underlying concern was similar, that official narratives about how government works were inadequate, that real power operated through channels that weren't visible or accountable, that citizens were being systematically deceived about who made decisions and why. For some of Danny's sources and supporters, this perspective was grounded in direct experience. These were people who'd worked in intelligence agencies, in the military, and law enforcement, who'd seen things that troubled them, who'd encountered operations that seemed to violate laws and norms, who'd been told to keep quiet about what they'd witnessed. Their testimony wasn't the product of paranoid imagination. It came from positions inside the system, from people who'd seen how the machinery of government actually operated beneath its public facade. But translating these individual experiences and observations into a coherent narrative of conspiracy was where things became complicated. Yes, this intelligence operative had witnessed something disturbing. Yes, that Justice Department attorney had seen evidence of misconduct. Yes, this military contractor had encountered operations that seemed illegal. But did all these separate instances of misconduct constitute a unified conspiracy? Or were they examples of the kind of institutional dysfunction and ethical compromise that occurs in any large organization, multiplied across the vast apparatus of the federal government? Danny believed they constituted conspiracy. He saw patterns, connections, evidence of coordination. But proving coordination is extraordinarily difficult. The fact that the same names appear in different scandals might mean they're part of a coordinated network. Or it might just mean that Washington is a small world where connected people move between different positions and become involved in multiple controversies over the course of their careers. The fact that money flows between various operations might indicate conspiracy, or it might reflect the reality that criminal networks, covert operations, and corrupt officials all operate in similar spaces and naturally interact even without central coordination. Danny's investigation into these questions was hampered by the limitations of his resources and access. He was one person working essentially alone, trying to document and prove allegations that, if true, would implicate powerful institutions with vast resources to defend themselves and conceal evidence. He couldn't compel testimony. He couldn't subpoena documents. He couldn't offer immunity to sources in exchange for cooperation. He had to rely on what people voluntarily told him, on what documents happened to leak, on his ability to piece together a story from fragments. And the people he was investigating weren't passive. If Danny's theory was correct, they were actively working to conceal their activities, to destroy evidence, to discredit investigators, possibly to eliminate threats. Even if the theory was wrong, the individuals Danny was writing about had reputations and careers to protect. They had lawyers. They had connections to media. They could fight back against allegations, could muddy the waters, could make it difficult for Danny to publish his findings. This asymmetry of power is a constant challenge for investigative journalists, particularly those working independently. The targets of investigation have resources that dwarf those available to freelance writers. They can tie up publication through legal threats. They can pressure publishers to drop controversial books. They can plant counter stories that confuse the public narrative. Danny was aware of these challenges, had expressed concerns about them to friends and family. He knew he was taking on powerful adversaries. In the months before his death, Danny's behavior showed signs of stress. Friends noticed that he seemed more anxious, more guarded in his communications, more worried about surveillance and interference. He made comments about his phone being tapped, about being followed, about sensing that he was under observation. To those who believed in his investigation, these were reasonable concerns given what he was pursuing. To those skeptical of conspiracy theories, they might have been signs of paranoia, of mental state deteriorating under the pressure of an obsessive investigation. Distinguishing between justified concern and paranoid delusion is difficult even for mental health professionals working directly with a patient. Trying to make that determination retrospectively, based on second-hand reports of comments Danny made, is essentially impossible. Was he being followed, or did he think was being followed? Were his fears grounded in real threats, or were they symptoms of psychological strain? we can't know with certainty. What we can say is that Danny's final weeks showed a man who believed he was on the verge of breakthrough. He was excited, energized, focused on the Martinsburg meeting. Whatever stress or anxiety he was feeling didn't manifest as depression or suicidal ideation, at least not in ways that were visible to the people around him. Every person who spoke with him in those final days described someone looking forward, making plans, anticipating success. This is the single strongest argument against the suicide ruling, the absence of any indication that Danny was contemplating taking his own life. Suicide is often impulsive, particularly violent suicide. People can make the decision in moments of acute crisis, without having shown prior signs of suicidal thinking. So the absence of warning signs doesn't prove Danny didn't kill himself. But it does make the suicide explanation less compelling. Most people who commit suicide, particularly those who plan enough to travel to a specific location and prepare a scene, show some indicators of their intentions. They make arrangements for their affairs. They say goodbye, sometimes explicitly, sometimes in ways that only make sense in retrospect. They show signs of hopelessness or despair. Danny showed none of these signs. His conversations in the final days were about the future, about what he would do after Martinsburg, about finishing his book, about exposing the octopus. He wasn't settling his affairs. He was advancing them. This doesn't make suicide impossible. Human psychology is complex and people can hide their true mental state, even from those close to them. But it does raise questions about the official explanation. The typed notes found at the scene, which were characterized as suicide notes, also raise questions. Suicide notes are typically deeply personal documents. They explain why the person is taking their life. They address loved ones, often apologizing for the pain the suicide will cause. They may express hopelessness, explain unbearable circumstances, or try to make sense of the decision for those left behind. The notes found with Danny's body, at least the portions that have been described publicly, don't fit this pattern. They were typed rather than handwritten, which is unusual. They were generic in tone, lacking specific references to Danny's life, his children, his investigation. They read more like templates than genuine final communications. The family's attorney later described them as not convincing as suicide notes, suggesting they felt fabricated rather than authentic. But the full contents of these notes have never been publicly released, making definitive analysis impossible. What exactly did they say? How many notes were there? What specific language did they use? Without access to this information, we're left with fragmentary descriptions and secondhand characterizations. It's possible that the notes were more convincing than critics have suggested, that there were personal elements not included in public descriptions to protect family privacy. Or it's possible that they were indeed suspicious, evidence of staging rather than genuine suicide documentation. The scene itself presents similar ambiguities. Danny was found in the bathtub fully clothed, with multiple deep cuts on his wrists and arms. The medical examiner counted between 10 and 12 distinct wounds. Some of these were described as superficial, initial cuts that didn't penetrate deeply enough. Others were deep, severing tendons and blood vessels. The pattern of wounds raises questions because it's unusual for suicide by cutting. Most people who kill themselves this way make 1 or 2 deep cuts. The pain and shock of severing tendons typically prevents the kind of cutting described in Danny's case. The body's natural response to such trauma includes physiological reactions that make it difficult to continue inflicting damage. Your hands lose strength and coordination as tendons are cut. The pain becomes overwhelming. Continuing to cut again and again requires overcoming powerful instinctual responses. This doesn't mean it's impossible. People in states of extreme psychological distress can override normal instinctual responses. Determination to die can enable people to inflict extraordinary damage on themselves. But the number and pattern of Danny's wounds struck some forensic experts as more consistent with defensive injuries. The kind of cuts that occur when someone is trying to protect themselves from an attacker, or with wounds inflicted by another person, rather than self-inflicted injuries. The counterargument is that Danny might have been hesitant, making several attempts before finding the courage or determination to cut deeply enough. That he might have been trying different approaches. different angles, different amounts of pressure. That the accumulation of wounds represented a process of working up to fatal injury rather than a single determined act. This interpretation is possible, though it requires imagining a prolonged and agonizing process that seems inconsistent with the practical mechanics of suicide by exsanguination. The bathroom itself was relatively undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of another person having been present. The door was locked from the inside, a fact that police emphasized in their suicide determination. How could someone have been murdered in a locked room? This is a classic locked room mystery, the kind beloved by detective fiction writers, but less common in real criminal cases. However, hotel room locks are not sophisticated security devices. They can be manipulated, locked from outside with appropriate tools or knowledge. Intelligence operatives, the kind of people Danny believed were after him, would presumably have both the skills and resources to stage a scene in a locked room. So the locked door, while it argues for suicide, doesn't prove it. It just means that if this was murder, it was carried out by people sophisticated enough to make it look like suicide. The water in the bathtub had turned cold and slightly discolored by the time the body was discovered. Based on the temperature and other factors, the medical examiner estimated that death had occurred sometime late Friday evening or early Saturday morning. This time frame meant that Danny had been dead for several hours, possibly as many as 12 or more, before being found. The delay complicated forensic analysis because it allowed time for mortem changes that could obscure evidence. One detail that has troubled investigators is the position of Danny's arms. They were draped over the sides of the bathtub, wrists facing upward, in what seemed like an almost theatrical pose. This positioning would be natural if someone were displaying self-inflicted wounds. But it also looked staged, as if someone had arranged the body to communicate suicide, rather than the position simply resulting from Danny's final moments. Of course, if Danny did kill himself, he might have deliberately positioned himself this way, understanding that the position would communicate his intentions. People planning suicide sometimes stage their deaths, arranging themselves in their surroundings to send particular messages or create specific impressions. So the theatrical quality of the scene doesn't prove murder. It just adds another element of ambiguity to an already ambiguous situation. The razor blades scattered on the bathroom floor presented forensic challenges. Multiple blades were present, suggesting that Danny had used several different implements. But as mentioned earlier, not all the blades bore clear fingerprints that could be attributed to Danny. The presence of blood and water complicated fingerprint analysis. Partial prints were found, but definitive identification proved difficult. The absence of clear prints on all the blades could be explained in multiple ways. If Danny was wearing the leather gloves that he sometimes carried, he might have used them to handle some of the blades initially before removing them. Blood and water could have obscured prints. The act of cutting might have smeared prints beyond recognition. Or, more sinister, someone else might have handled some of the blades, staging the scene to look like suicide while leaving forensic anomalies that would only be apparent to careful analysis. The investigation conducted by the Martinsburg police did not include sophisticated forensic analysis of the scene. This was a small-town police department dealing with what appeared to be a straightforward suicide. They didn't treat it as a potential homicide. They didn't collect evidence with the rigor that a murder investigation would require. By the time questions were raised about the death, by the time the family began pushing for more thorough examination, the scene had been cleaned, evidence had been lost, and the opportunity for careful forensic work had passed. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. If investigators had treated Danny's death as suspicious from the beginning, if they'd conducted a thorough examination of the scene and preserved all evidence, if they'd delayed the embalming and performed a comprehensive autopsy, many of the questions that now haunt the case might have been resolved. But they didn't, and we're left with a fragmentary evidentiary record that supports multiple interpretations. The missing briefcase and documents remain perhaps the most compelling evidence that something unusual happened in Rue 517. Danny had told multiple people that he was bringing research materials to Martinsburg. Friends described him as meticulous about keeping his notes and documents organized and accessible. He would not have traveled to an important meeting without the materials he needed to reference and discuss. Yet when police inventoried the room, they found no briefcase, no research files, no notebooks. Nothing related to Danny's investigation. His personal effects were present, his toiletries, his clothing, his wallet. But his work materials were gone. The official explanation, such as it was, suggested that perhaps Danny had never brought these materials, that witnesses were mistaken about what he'd said he was carrying, or that he'd left them in his car, though a search of his rental vehicle found nothing, or that he disposed of them before his death, though no explanation was offered for why he would do this, or where they might have gone. The family and supporters saw the missing materials as obvious evidence of foul play. Someone had taken Danny's research, either to prevent his investigation from being completed or to assess what he'd learned, and who else might have access to his findings. If Danny had been murdered by people connected to the octopus, they would have wanted to know what evidence he'd gathered, what sources he'd contacted, how close he'd come to exposing them. Taking his briefcase would be a logical step in managing the aftermath of his assassination. But proving that the briefcase existed and was taken by unknown parties is difficult. We have testimony from people who say Danny told them he was bringing research materials, but we don't have photographs of him carrying a briefcase into the hotel. We don't have hotel staff who remember seeing him with files and documents. The evidence for the missing materials is circumstantial, based on what Danny reportedly said rather than on physical documentation. This pattern, suggestive evidence that, short of definitive proof, characterizes much of the case for Danny's murder. Each individual element is ambiguous. The wounds could be suicide or murder. The locked door could be evidence of suicide or sophisticated staging. The missing materials could be proof of foul play or confusion about what Danny actually brought with him. The suspicious notes could be fabricated or simply unusual examples of genuine suicide communications. Taken individually, each piece of evidence can be explained in ways consistent with suicide. But taken together, the accumulation of anomalies creates a picture that troubles many observers. How many unusual elements can we attribute to coincidence or misunderstanding before we have to consider that maybe something more sinister occurred? This is ultimately a question of probability and pattern recognition. Skeptics argue that unusual features in a death don't prove murder, that we should default to the simpler explanation, unless presented with definitive evidence of foul play. Supporters of the murder theory argue that the pattern of anomalies, when viewed holistically, makes suicide implausible, that the combination of suspicious elements overwhelms the presumption of suicide. There's no objective way to resolve this disagreement. It comes down to how we weight different types of evidence, how we assess probability, how skeptical or credulous we are about conspiracy theories, how much we trust official investigations versus alternative interpretations. People of good faith, examining the same evidence, reach different conclusions. What makes Danny's case particularly difficult is that it exists in the intersection of true crime investigation and political conspiracy theory. If Danny had been an ordinary person, a businessman or teacher or salesman, and died under these circumstances, the case would be evaluated purely on the forensic and circumstantial evidence. We'd ask, do the wounds look self-inflicted? Was there evidence of depression? Were there signs of another person in the room? These would be straightforward evidentiary questions. But Danny wasn't an ordinary person. He was investigating alleged government conspiracies. He'd expressed fears about being targeted. He'd told people that if something happened to him, it wouldn't be accident or suicide. So evaluating his death requires not just forensic analysis but also assessment of the plausibility of the conspiracies he was investigating. If the octopus was real and felt threatened by Danny's investigation, murder becomes more plausible. If the octopus was paranoid fantasy, suicide becomes the more likely explanation. This means that opinions about Danny's death often correlate with opinions about government and conspiracy more broadly. People inclined to believe that powerful institutions commit crimes and cover them up tend to believe Danny was murdered. People skeptical of conspiracy theories tend to accept the suicide ruling. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous enough that prior beliefs heavily influence interpretation. In the decades since Danny's death, numerous other journalists, researchers, and activists have died under circumstances that their supporters deemed suspicious. Gary Webb, who exposed CIA connections to cocaine trafficking, died from 2 gunshot wounds to the head in what was ruled a suicide despite the unusual circumstance of multiple shots. Michael Hastings, who wrote critical pieces about military and intelligence operations, died in a fiery car crash that conspiracy theorists attributed to foul play. Seth Rich, a Democratic National Committee staffer, was murdered in what police said was a botched robbery, but which became the subject of elaborate conspiracy theories. Each of these cases, like Danny's, involves ambiguous evidence that can be interpreted in multiple ways. Each has become a touchstone for communities that believe powerful institutions silence inconvenient voices, and each is disputed by skeptics who see patterns where none exist, who attribute to conspiracy what can be explained by tragedy, mental illness, or random violence. Danny Casolaro's death exists in this contentious landscape. It's simultaneously a legitimate mystery with troubling unanswered questions, and a conspiracy theory that reflects broader anxieties about power and accountability. Both things can be true at the same time. The questions about his death can be genuine and worthy of investigation, while also being exploited by conspiracy theorists who use his case to advance broader narratives that may not be justified by the evidence. The town of Martinsburg itself became part of the mystery surrounding Danny's death. Why had he gone there? Who had he been meeting? What made this small West Virginia city the location for what Danny believed would be his breakthrough meeting? Martinsburg in 1991 was an unremarkable place. It had a population of around 15,000 people, located in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, closer geographically and culturally to Maryland and Virginia than to the rest of the state. It was a working-class town, home to railroad workers, government employees, and people who commuted to jobs in the surrounding region. It had a small, historic downtown, residential neighborhoods spreading out into surrounding hills, and the kind of quiet, unassuming character that defines countless American small cities. There was nothing inherently suspicious about Martinsburg. It wasn't known as a hub for intelligence operations or organized crime. It didn't have the kind of infrastructure that would naturally attract someone investigating government conspiracies, which is precisely what made it an interesting location for a clandestine meeting. If you wanted to meet someone away from the attention and surveillance that might exist in Washington, D.C., or other major cities, a quiet hotel in a small town would be ideal. Danny had told several people that he was meeting sources in Martinsburg, though he'd been vague about their identities. This vagueness was characteristic of his approach to protecting sources. He understood that revealing who he was talking to could put those people at risk, could compromise their willingness to provide information. So he would refer to sources obliquely, describing their general background or role without naming them specifically. Based on comments Danny made before his trip, investigators later tried to determine who he might have been meeting. Some speculated it was Michael Riconosciuto or associates of Riconosciuto who'd promised additional documentation about the PRS software modifications. Others thought it might have been intelligence community sources who'd agreed to provide classified information about covert operations. Still others suggested it could have been organized crime figures connected to the Cabazon case or other tentacles of the octopus. But no one came forward after Danny's death to identify themselves as the person or people he'd been scheduled to meet. No source contacted his family or his associates to explain what had happened. This silence struck many observers as suspicious. If Danny had been meeting legitimate sources who were trying to help him expose corruption, wouldn't they have come forward after his death to provide information, or at least to confirm that they'd met with him? Their continued anonymity suggested either that they were complicit in his death, or that they were afraid, unwilling to expose themselves to whatever risks Danny had encountered. Of course, there's another possibility, that the meeting was a setup from the beginning, that whoever contacted Danny and lured him to Martinsburg did so specifically to get him alone in a location where he could be killed. This theory suggests premeditation planning, a sophisticated operation designed to eliminate Danny while creating plausible deniability. If true, it would mean that Danny walked into a trap, trusting people who intended to murder him. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial. We know Danny went to Martinsburg expecting to meet sources. We know he ended up dead in suspicious circumstances. We know his research materials disappeared. But we don't have documentation of who contacted him, what they promised, how the meeting was arranged. Danny's phone records from the period before his trip might have provided clues, but these records were either not thoroughly examined or have not been made public. The hotel staff at the Sheraton Inn were interviewed after Danny's death, but their recollections provided little useful information. They remembered Danny checking in, described him as seeming normal, not distressed. Some recalled seeing him in the hotel's common areas, possibly meeting with people, but no one could provide detailed descriptions of who these people might have been. The hotel didn't have extensive security camera coverage, so there was no video record of Danny's movements, or of who might have visited his room. One witness claimed to have seen Danny in the hotel bar on the evening before his body was discovered, talking with two men. The description of these men was vague, middle-aged, professionally dressed. Nothing particularly distinctive. The witness couldn't say whether Danny seemed comfortable with these men or under duress, whether the conversation appeared friendly or tense. This sighting, if accurate, suggests that Danny did meet with someone in Martinsburg, that he wasn't alone the entire time. But it doesn't tell us who these men were or what transpired between them. Another guest at the hotel reported hearing what sounded like an argument coming from one of the rooms late Friday night, though they couldn't specify which room or what was being said. This report was never thoroughly investigated, and it's unclear whether the sounds came from room 517 or from elsewhere in the hotel. Arguments in hotel rooms aren't uncommon, and connecting this reported disturbance to Danny's death requires speculation that may not be warranted. What we're left with is a fragmentary record of Danny's time in Martinsburg. He arrived Thursday afternoon. He checked into the hotel. He apparently met with someone or multiple someones during his stay. Sometime Friday night or early Saturday morning, he ended up dead in his bathtub. The hours in between remain largely unknown, a crucial gap in our understanding of what happened. This gap is where theories multiply. In the absence of solid information, people fill the void with speculation that reflects their prior beliefs about Danny's investigation and death. Those convinced of murder imagine scenarios of surveillance, confrontation, assassination. Those who believe in suicide envision Danny having disappointing meetings, receiving bad news about his investigation, falling into despair that led to taking his own life. Neither scenario can be definitively proven or disproven with available evidence. The truth about those missing hours went to the grave with Danny, and unless someone who was present comes forward with information, it will remain unknown. The question of motive looms large in evaluating the murder theory. If Danny was killed, who had reason to kill him? And was his investigation actually threatening enough to justify murder? Proponents of the murder theory point to the powerful individuals and institutions that Danny was investigating. If his allegations about Parmas were true, senior Justice Department officials had committed serious crimes. If the October surprise claims were accurate, high-ranking political operatives had essentially committed treason. If the octopus existed as Danny theorized, it represented a criminal network with vast resources and connections that would be threatened by exposure. Any of these parties, the theory goes, might have decided that Danny represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. A book exposing their crimes could lead to investigations, prosecutions, disgrace, possibly prison. For people with that much to lose, murder might seem like a rational, if evil, choice. Danny's death would stop his investigation, prevent publication of his book, and serve as a warning to others who might consider pursuing similar lines of inquiry. But skeptics question whether Danny's investigation really posed such a significant threat. Yes, he'd been working on the story for years. Yes, he'd accumulated documents and testimony. But had he actually uncovered proof that would convince prosecutors to bring charges or publishers to risk lawsuits? The fact that mainstream media hadn't picked up his story, that his attempts to publish articles about the octopus had largely been limited to alternative outlets, suggested that the mainstream establishment didn't find his evidence particularly compelling. If powerful conspirators were monitoring Danny's investigation, if they had the sources within journalism and publishing to know what he was working on, they would presumably understand that he didn't have the kind of proof that would threaten them. His book, even if published, would likely be dismissed as conspiracy theory, reviewed poorly if at all by mainstream media, purchased primarily by people already inclined to believe in government conspiracies. Why risk murdering him and potentially creating a martyr when ignoring him would be safer and just as effective at preventing his allegations from gaining traction? This argument has force, but it also has counters. Perhaps Danny had recently obtained evidence that changed the calculus, that transformed his investigation from interesting speculation to genuine threat. The timing of his death, coming right after he'd told people he was on the verge of a breakthrough, suggests that something had changed. Maybe he'd acquired documents that proved his case. Maybe a source had agreed to testify. Maybe he'd made a connection that pulled everything together in a way that will be undeniable. If this breakthrough was real, if Danny had finally gotten the proof he needed, then the threat he posed would have increased dramatically, and the window for stopping him would have been narrow. Once his book was complete, once documents were in the hands of publishers and lawyers, killing him would be pointless. The information would already be out there. But if they could get to him before he'd secured and distributed his evidence, before he'd completed his manuscript, they could stop the investigation and seize whatever proof he'd obtained. This interpretation makes the Martinsburg meeting central to understanding Danny's death. If the meeting was where he was supposed to receive crucial evidence, it was also the perfect opportunity to intercept and eliminate him. He'd come expecting to receive information that would vindicate years of investigation. Instead, he'd walked into a trap. But this requires believing that the octopus was real, was monitoring Danny's investigation, knew about the Martinsburg meeting, and had the operational capacity to organize his murder on short notice. Each of these assumptions is debatable. Stacked together, they create a scenario that some find plausible and others find wildly implausible. The alternative interpretation is much simpler. Danny went to Martinsburg expecting a breakthrough. Instead, he had disappointing meetings. Maybe his sources didn't deliver what they'd promised. Maybe he realized that what he'd been told was exaggerated or false. Maybe he confronted the reality that his investigation, despite years of work, wasn't going to produce the definitive proof he needed. And in that moment of crushing disappointment, alone in a hotel room far from home, he made the terrible decision to end his life. This explanation accounts for the circumstances without requiring a vast conspiracy. It's tragic but straightforward. A man under enormous pressure, financially stressed, isolated by his obsessive investigation, reaching a breaking point and choosing suicide. It's not uncommon for people to kill themselves in hotel rooms, away from home, in moments of acute crisis. The planning involved in traveling to Martinsburg doesn't contradict suicide. It just means the crisis emerged during the trip rather than before it. But this explanation struggles with the absence of warning signs. People who knew Danny, who spoke with him in the days before death, universally described him as optimistic and energized, not depressed or hopeless. His conversations weren't the conversations of someone contemplating suicide. He was making plans for the future, talking about what would happen after he finished his book, anticipating success rather than contemplating death. Could he have been hiding his true mental state? Absolutely. People conceal suicidal thoughts all the time, presenting cheerful facades while struggling with inner turmoil. But the consistency of descriptions from multiple sources, the complete absence of any indication of suicidal ideation, makes this explanation feel insufficient. It requires us to believe that Danny was an exceptionally skilled actor, that he managed to fool everyone who knew him about his psychological state, that he maintained this deception right up until the moment he killed himself. The physical evidence of the death scene also poses challenges for the simple suicide explanation. The number and pattern of wounds, the missing research materials, The questionable suicide notes, the suspicious elements that investigators noted, these aren't easily dismissed. Each individual anomaly might have an innocent explanation, but the accumulation of unusual features suggests that something more complex than straightforward suicide occurred. What if the truth lies between the extremes? What if Danny's death involved elements of both suicide and external pressure, but not in the way usually imagined? Consider the scenario. Danny went to Martinsburg and met with sources who did provide him with information or documents. But during these meetings, he was threatened. Not physically assaulted, but warned. Told that continuing his investigation would have consequences. Told that he and his family were vulnerable. Told that powerful people knew what he was doing and wouldn't allow him to publish his findings. These threats might have been oblique, implied rather than explicit, the kind of intimidation that's difficult to prove but nonetheless effective. After these meetings, alone in his hotel room, Danny might have faced a terrible choice. He could continue his investigation, publish his book, and expose himself and his family to retaliation. Or he could abandon years of work, accept that he'd been defeated, live with the knowledge that the corruption he'd uncovered would continue unchecked. The despair of that choice, the impossibility of moving forward or giving up, might have pushed him toward suicide not as a simple act of depression, but as a response to an impossible situation. In this interpretation, Danny's death would still be suicide in the technical sense. He inflicted the fatal wounds on himself. But it would be suicide caused by external pressure, by threats and intimidate-created circumstances where death seemed preferable to the alternatives. His killers, if we want to call them that, would be the people who threatened him, who created the conditions that led to his death, even if they didn't physically murder him. This scenario is speculative, unsupported by direct evidence, but it offers a middle ground between straightforward suicide and planned assassination. It accounts for some of the anomalies in the case while avoiding the need to prove a sophisticated murder and cover-up. And it aligns with Danny's statements about being afraid, about being targeted, without requiring us to believe that he was killed in his hotel room. Of course, this scenario still requires believing that Danny was investigating something real and threatening, that the people he was researching took him seriously enough to threaten him, that the octopus or some version of it existed. If his investigation was chasing shadows, if the conspiracies he theorized weren't real, then there would be no one with motive to threaten him. The frustrating reality is that we can't definitively establish whether the octopus was real without the evidence Danny was allegedly gathering. And we can't access that evidence because it disappeared with his death. We're stuck in a circular problem where proving the conspiracy requires Danny's research, but evaluating his death requires knowing whether the conspiracy existed. What we can say with confidence is that Danny was investigating real scandals and real misconduct, even if the scope and coordination of that misconduct remain disputed. Promes was stolen from Inslaw. This is acknowledged even by official investigations, though the extent of its subsequent use for surveillance remains debated. Iran-Contra happened. This is established historical fact. BC was massively corrupt. This is proven beyond doubt. The Cabazon Reservation case involved genuine criminal activity. This is documented. So Danny wasn't chasing complete fantasy. He was investigating real events, real scandals, real corruption. The question is whether these separate instances of misconduct were connected in the ways he theorized, whether they constituted the tentacles of a single octopus, or were independent cases that happened to occur in the same general timeframe and involved some overlapping personalities. Even if we grant that Danny's broader conspiracy theory wasn't fully accurate, that the octopus as he conceived it didn't exist, it's still possible that his investigation threatened specific individuals involved in specific crimes. You don't need a vast unified conspiracy to have motive for murder. A corrupt Justice Department official who'd stolen software, an intelligence operative who'd run illegal operations, an organized crime figure connected to the Cabazon case. Any of these might have felt threatened by exposure and might have decided to eliminate the threat. This more limited conspiracy theory doesn't require coordinating across decades and multiple agencies. It just requires one or more bad actors deciding that Danny needed to be stopped. The murder could have been opportunistic rather than planned far in advance. Someone Danny was meeting in Martinsburg might have made a snap decision that he was too dangerous to leave alive. Or the meeting might have been a setup from the beginning, but organized by a small group rather than a vast network. These scenarios are impossible to investigate adequately 3 decades after the fact. The people who might have been involved are dead, retired, or have no incentive to come forward. The evidence has long since been lost or destroyed. The trail, if there ever was one, has gone completely cold. What remains is the legacy of Danny's investigation and death, the impact it had on the people who knew him, and on the broader communities of journalists and conspiracy researchers who followed his story. For his family, the unresolved questions about his death have been a source of ongoing pain and frustration. They've had to live with uncertainty, with the knowledge that they'll probably never get definitive answers about what happened to Danny. For his children, growing up without their father was made more difficult by the controversy surrounding his death. They had to navigate not just the grief of losing a parent, but also the competing narratives about whether he killed himself or was murdered, whether he was a brave investigative journalist or someone who'd lost touch with reality. These are terrible burdens for children to carry, and the public nature of the conspiracy theories surrounding Danny's death meant they couldn't grieve privately. For journalists and researchers who followed in Danny's footsteps, his case became a cautionary tale. Some saw it as proof of the dangers of investigating powerful institutions, evidence that pursuing certain stories could get you killed. Others viewed it as a warning about the psychological toll of conspiracy research, about how obsession with uncovering grand conspiracies could lead to professional ruin and personal tragedy. Both interpretations influenced how journalists approached similar investigations in subsequent years. The rise of the internet in the decades following Danny's death gave his case new visibility and new life. Websites dedicated to conspiracy research featured extensive materials about his investigation and death. Discussion forums debated the evidence endlessly. Amateur investigators pored over every detail, developing elaborate theories about what had happened. Danny became something of a patron saint for conspiracy researchers, a symbol of the independent investigator pursuing truth against powerful opposition. But this attention also meant that Danny's case became intermixed with less credible conspiracy theories. That his serious investigation of documented scandals was associated with claims about UFOs, ancient aliens, and other fringe topics. This association probably hurt efforts to get mainstream media and official investigators to take the questions about his death seriously. When Danny's name appeared primarily on conspiracy websites alongside obvious nonsense, it became easier for skeptics to dismiss the entire case as conspiracy fantasy. In recent years, there have been a few attempts to bring renewed attention to Danny's case through documentaries and podcast series. These productions have varied in quality and approach. Some have been serious attempts to investigate the evidence and present a balanced view of what might have happened. Others have been more sensational, emphasizing the conspiracy angle and treating Danny's murder as established fact rather than contested theory. The best of these productions have made a valuable contribution by preserving testimony from people who knew Danny, by documenting the evidence that exists, by keeping the case alive for new generations who might have fresh perspectives or new information. The worst have exploited Danny's death for entertainment value, turning a human tragedy into content that prioritizes drama over truth. One consistent theme across nearly all coverage of Danny's case, whether sympathetic or skeptical, is acknowledgement that the questions surrounding his death deserve better answers than they've received. Even people who believe the suicide ruling is probably correct generally agree that the investigation was inadequate, that the hasty embalming was improper, that the family deserved more thorough examination of the circumstances. The quality of the official investigation was poor by any standard, and that failure has contributed to the ongoing controversy. If Danny's death had been investigated competently from the beginning, if evidence had been preserved, if the medical examination had been thorough, if witnesses had been carefully interviewed and their testimony documented, we might have definitive answers today. The investigation might have either confirmed suicide beyond reasonable doubt or uncovered clear evidence of homicide. Instead, the botched investigation left ambiguity that has fueled speculation for more than 30 years. This investigative failure raises its own questions. Was it simply incompetence, the result of a small-town police department being overwhelmed by a case that seemed straightforward but was actually complex? Or was it something more sinister? Evidence of pressure or interference that prevented thorough investigation. Danny's supporters tend toward the latter interpretation, seeing the inadequate investigation as part of the cover-up. Skeptics generally favor the incompetence explanation, noting that small police departments routinely fail to investigate unusual deaths as thoroughly as they should. The years have passed, but the mystery of Danny Casolaro's death refuses to fade into obscurity. His case remains suspended between tragedy and conspiracy, between a man who lost his way and a journalist who got too close to dangerous truths. The ambiguity that has defined this case from the beginning continues to define it today, more than 3 decades after that August morning when a housekeeper opened the door to room 517. For those who loved Danny, the passage of time has brought no closure, no peace. His brother Tony spent the rest of his life insisting that Danny had been murdered, that justice had been denied, that powerful forces had gotten away with silencing a truth teller. Tony died without ever getting the answers he sought, carrying his conviction about his brother's fate to his own grave. The certainty Tony felt, the unwavering belief that Danny would never have killed himself, remained unchanged despite decades of official insistence to the contrary. Danny's children have had to construct their own understanding of what happened to their father. They've had to sift through competing narratives, evaluate evidence they're not qualified to assess, live with uncertainty about whether their father chose to leave them or was taken from them by violence. There's no good answer, no version of events that makes his absence easier to bear. Whether he killed himself or was murdered, they lost their father far too soon, and the controversy surrounding his death has complicated their ability to grieve and remember him simply as the man who loved them. The researchers and journalists who followed Danny's investigation over the years have reached varying conclusions. Some remain convinced that he uncovered genuine evidence of vast criminal conspiracy, that the octopus was real, that his death was murder orchestrated to protect powerful interests. Others have concluded that Danny was sincere but mistaken, that he connected dots that shouldn't have been connected, that he fell victim to the seductive logic of conspiracy, thinking where every coincidence becomes evidence and every denial becomes proof of cover-up. What seems clear is that Danny was a man of integrity pursuing what he believed was truth. Whether that pursuit led him toward genuine revelation or into a labyrinth of paranoia, his commitment was real. He sacrificed financial security, personal relationships, peace of mind, all in service of exposing what he saw as corruption at the highest levels of American government. That kind of dedication deserves respect, even from those who question the validity of his conclusions. The broader questions Danny's investigation raised remain relevant today. How much criminal activity operates within government institutions? How effectively can independent journalists investigate powerful interests? What happens to people who pursue inconvenient truths? These aren't abstract questions. They touch on fundamental issues about democracy, accountability, and the relationship between citizens and the state. In the decades since Danny's death, numerous revelations have confirmed that government agencies do conduct illegal operations, that officials do lie and cover up misconduct, that whistleblowers do face retaliation. The specific conspiracy Danny theorized may or may not have existed, but the general pattern he identified of covert operations and institutional resistance to accountability has been validated again and again. Perhaps that's Danny's real legacy. Not whether he proved the octopus existed, but that he asked the right questions. He refused to accept official narratives at face value. He followed evidence even when it led to uncomfortable conclusions. He believed that citizens deserved to know what their government was doing, that secrecy and power could conceal terrible crimes, that journalism's highest calling was to expose wrongdoing regardless of who was implicated. These principles remain vital, perhaps more vital than ever in an era of increasing government secrecy, corporate power, and institutional opacity. The questions Danny asked about who really controls the levers of power, about whether democratic institutions truly govern or merely provide cover for deeper networks of influence, these questions haven't been answered. They've only become more urgent. The Sheraton Inn in Martinsburg still stands, though it's changed ownership and names over the years. Room 517 has been occupied by countless guests since that August weekend in 1991. People who likely have no idea about the death that occurred there, the mystery that still surrounds it. The bathroom has been renovated, the tub replaced, any physical traces of what happened long since erased by time and maintenance. But the questions persist. They echo through online forums and conspiracy documentaries, through articles written by journalists who discover Danny's case and become fascinated by its ambiguities. Every few years, someone new takes up the investigation, convinced they'll be the one to finally solve the mystery, to definitively prove murder or suicide, to give Danny's family and supporters the answers they've sought for so long. None have succeeded. The evidence remains stubbornly ambiguous, capable of supporting multiple interpretations, insufficient to prove any single theory beyond reasonable doubt. And so the debate continues, year after year, with no resolution in sight. Perhaps there's a lesson in that persistence, in the refusal of Danny's case to be forgotten or neatly categorized. Some mysteries resist solution not because the truth is unknowable, but because the available evidence is genuinely ambiguous, because reasonable people can weigh the same facts and reach different conclusions, because life doesn't always provide the clarity we crave. Danny Casolaro believed he was close to exposing one of the greatest conspiracies in American history. Whether he was right or wrong about that, whether he was murdered to silence his investigation or tragically took his own life, he remains a figure worth remembering. A journalist who took risks, who asked difficult questions, who refused to be satisfied with easy answers. The octopus, if it existed, may have succeeded in stopping Danny's investigation. But it couldn't erase the questions he raised, couldn't prevent his story from inspiring others to pursue similar investigations, couldn't eliminate the doubt about official narratives that cases like his create. In the end, Danny Casolaro's legacy isn't the book he never finished or the conspiracy he couldn't quite prove. It's the reminder that in a democracy, someone needs to ask uncomfortable questions, to investigate the powerful, to refuse to accept secrecy and deception as the price of security. Whether that pursuit led Danny to truth or tragedy, the pursuit itself mattered. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.